Think about the last time you truly laughed. Not just a polite chuckle, but that deep, uncontrollable laughter that takes over your entire body. What was happening in your life at that moment? What tension were you carrying that suddenly, inexplicably released? There's something almost miraculous about how laughter can transform our heaviest burdens into something momentarily weightless. It's as if our psyche has this built-in pressure valve that knows exactly when we need it most. But why? What is it about laughter that can take our deepest anxieties, our most overwhelming stress, even our profound grief, and offer this brief but vital reprieve? Today we're exploring laughter not as entertainment, but as one of the most sophisticated survival tools, a uniquely human way of finding light in darkness, of processing the unprocessable, and of discovering that sometimes relief comes not from solving our problems, but from finding a moment of joy despite them. I'm Dr. Stephen Stoltz, academic at the University of Adelaide, and this podcast series is my quest to help everyday people access research-based ideas that feed curiosity and foster deep thinking. In today's episode, I explore the topic of humour and explore the psychology of humour, some well-known theories of humour, the role of humour on health and well-being, and consider some potential applications of humour. Whether you want to know more about humour or you're just interested in learning more about the benefits of humour, it's your framework and practical insights to navigate this important area of life. By the end of our time together, you'll understand the psychology of humour, the role of humour on health and well-being, and some potential applications. So join me as I bridge the gap between evidence-based research and everyday application. This is Deep Thinking with Dr. Stephen Stoltz. Do you like to have a laugh? Like most people, I actually really love to have a laugh, particularly with others. In fact, producer Luke, the truckie from Petrie, and I both like to have a laugh, often at each other's expense, I should point out. And one obvious example occurred the other day when my 8-year-old daughter, Renee, big shout out to Renee, who might be listening to this, she was looking through for some pictures on my iPhone for a school project. And for about 5 minutes, when she was playing with my iPhone, she turned to me and she said to me innocently, "Dad, why do you have so many pictures of Luke without a shirt on your phone?" Now, my daughter was right. I do have a disproportionate number of pictures of producer Luke without a shirt on my iPhone. And at the time, I did find this quite amusing. And when I told producer Luke, he also found it quite funny. So I guess you could say it's now part of an ongoing joke we both share. As for the reasons why I have so many photos of Luke without a shirt on my phone, well, this is a story for another time. I also like to have a laugh with others, like Turbo and Sludge at the pub. And for most people, their humour could be described as old school humour. So it's not really going to appeal to all people. But they are genuinely funny guys who don't take themselves too seriously. In fact, I already know their humour would not appeal to many of my students at university. And that's an interesting question in and of itself. Why? But in a world where everyone is so serious all the time, it is actually quite refreshing. And there is actually something really infectious about laughter that is really hard to resist. In the same way we like to laugh, we also seem to be drawn to funny people. And the most obvious representation of the funny person is the comedian. And is often associated with humour and laughter. Personally, I'm a huge fan of the TV series Seinfeld, which is known as an observational type of comedy with the famous tagline, "A show about nothing." The TV show involves 4 main characters, which are Jerry Seinfeld, playing a fictionalised version of himself. Then we have George Costanza, played by Jason Alexander. He's one of my favourite characters, and I think he's an excellent representation of all of the neuroses that are found in human beings in general. Then we have Elaine Bennis, played by Julie Louis-Dreyfus. And then we have Cosmo Kramer, played by Michael Richards. And I know quite a few people who are like Cosmo Kramer. Now, each character has become iconic for their neuroses and distinct personalities in their TV series. I just mentioned before about George Costanza. I think he's a brilliant character. Now, I should point out that I'm not really a fan of Jerry Seinfeld stand-up comedy, but there is something about the TV show that is really clever and witty that has me in stitches time and time again. In fact, I'm forever talking about different episodes and funny moments. And I think some of the episode themes are absolutely brilliant. They just are so brilliant. Like the soft talker, the high talker, the close talker, manhinge, shrinkage, double dip, the contest, the puffy shirt, the soup Nazi, along with plenty of memorable catchphrases like the master of my domain, no soup for you, serenity now, yada yada. These pretzels are making me thirsty. And I could go on and on. Now, recently I had one of these kind of pretzel type moments with someone who wanted me to kind of present something in a certain way. And I know producer Luke and I have a whole range of different discussions around these podcasts. And I guess you could say they're kind of like pretzels type kind of conversations. However, this conversation was actually with a colleague at work. And I happen to know this colleague quite well. And I remember we kind of burst out laughing. Well, actually, I should say I burst out laughing at the time because of the absurdity of the conversation, because it was hard not to see parallels with this episode. That's the Seinfeld episode. That's the Pretzels Seinfeld episode, where each character takes a turn reading the line Kramer is meant to say in a Woody Allen film. Now, if you're wondering, like I said before, I know this other person very well from work, and so they were quite aware of the inside joke from Seinfeld. And so we both had a long laugh-out moment after taking turns saying, these pretzels are making me thirsty. And even today, as I talk to you about this, I do have a smile on my face. It's actually a brilliant episode. Now, speaking of the comedian as the representation of a funny person, now there is actually a long list of comedians who are popular and actually have mass appeal to wide audiences like Dave Chappelle, Louis C.K., Bill Burr, Aziz Ansari, Sarah Silverman, and I could go on, and that's actually quite a long list. But there's something about edgy comedians that I automatically were drawn to, and they actually are worth a mention. And I automatically, when I think of edgy comedians, I think of people like Ricky Gervais and Sacha Baron Cohen, particularly Borat, the film, and the character Borat, are famous for being controversial. Now, I do realise that when it comes to edgy comedians that are controversial, this potentially could be a long list of names. And I guess it just depends on who you ask. But this is not really necessarily about names per se, as in like edgy type comedians. And I think it's more about how comedy is often characterised by edgy humour and misplaced jokes that has this potential to provoke quite a personal and social anxiety in a lot of people and cause divisive cultural warfare in the media and among people. Now, today, comedy seems to be fraught with tension like never before, and so too is our social life. And we often hear the claim, or at least I do, that no one can take a joke anymore, but what if we really can't take a joke anymore? Now, I promise I only want to briefly touch on the serious side of jokes for a moment, in response to the claim that no one could take a joke anymore. And I promised producer Luke that I'd keep this short and sweet. But, I mean, what do you think? I mean, do you think we have lost the capacity to take a joke? I mean, how about you? Can you take a joke? I don't know. I think there's something here that's actually worth thinking about, and we'll just kind of briefly touch on this. Now, I do realise that laughter and humour isn't always kind, because we often laugh at others' pain, at tragedy, at things that should actually horrify us. Indeed, comedy clubs seem to thrive on cruelty in disguise as cleverness. And yet the same mechanism, this ability to find absurdity in darkness, might be humanity's greatest survival tool. Now, this is the paradox of humour and laughter that actually fascinates me, and I guess that's why I wanted to do this episode. And humour and laughter is fundamentally subversive, and this is the bit that I guess is paradoxical. It deflates authority, it challenges taboos, and reveals uncomfortable truths through the back door of our consciousness. Now, we laugh because something doesn't fit our expectations, and that cognitive dissonance is where real thinking begins. And this question isn't whether humour and laughter can go too far. It's actually whether we're brave enough to examine why we're laughing and to ask why we consider a joke to be offensive or even controversial. As such, it is worth exploring the psychology of humour and laughter in order to make sense of these very questions. So I'm going to turn to these questions now. We all know what it's like to experience humour in some form or another. Someone tells a joke, relates an amusing personal anecdote, or it just makes a witty comment, and so on. Now, depending on how amusing we perceive the event to be, it might cause us to smile. It might cause us to laugh, a chuckle. Or we could just burst out into convulsive laughter. I just want you to pause for a moment and just think about something funny now. Does it make you smile? Maybe chuckle, or does it just make you burst out into laughter? This is one of those things about humour that I find interesting. Now, humour and laughter are universal and fundamental human experiences, which actually, interesting enough, occur across all cultures and virtually all individuals throughout the world and in nearly every type of interpersonal relationship. Now, although different cultures have their own norms concerning suitable subject matter of what is considered to be humorous or not, but the types of situations where laughter is considered appropriate and the sounds of laughter, they're just indistinguishable from one culture to another. And interesting enough, some of our first social vocalizations, after crying, of course, in human infants are of laughter. And the ability to enjoy humour and express it through laughter seems to be an essential part of what it means to be a human being, actually. As you can understand, humour and laughter are topics of popular interest that have captured the imagination and critical attention of scholars from multiple disciplines dating back to the writings of classical Greek philosophers like Plato and Aristotle. And so this leads to the obvious question, what is humour? The perception that something is funny seems to be a fundamental aspect of defining what humour means. However, we use the term humour in a variety of contexts to mean different things. Indeed, scholars have operationally defined and measured humour in terms of different facets of the human experience that are relevant to specific research questions. As a result, the term humour has come to represent all phenomena related to the humour experience. And basically, there are kind of a couple of key points that I'm just going to mention here now. And they are basically humour is broadly a multifaceted term that represents anything people say or do that others perceive as funny and tends to make them laugh. And the other point I want to make here is that it also involves mental processes which allow us to both create and perceive an amusing stimulus, which then often triggers an emotional response of mirth involved in the enjoyment of it. And that's the laughter response. Now, it's important to emphasise that humour is fundamentally a social phenomenon. Other people provide the context in which we experience humour. We laugh or joke much more frequently when we are with other people than when we are by ourselves. However, people do occasionally laugh when they are alone, such as while watching a comedy on TV or just maybe reading a funny book or whatever. However, these instances of laughter are still social in the sense they involve imagined or implied presence of other people, right? One is still responding to people as characters in the TV program or the book or whatever it is you're reliving in your memory. And so that's why humour is essentially a way for people to interact in a playful manner. From a psychological point of view, humour represents a form of social play, and so no definition of humour really, and no theory of wit or no explanation of comic laughter will ever stand up which is not based upon the distinction between playful and serious. Now, basically, humour is a form of social play that can be divided into three essential psychological elements related to cognition, emotion, and behaviour. Let me briefly explain the basic psychological elements of humour. For example, when a person experiences a stimulus event, the cognitive perceptual processes appraise the stimulus as funny, which triggers a unique emotional response of mirth. And then the vocal behavioural expression, that's the bit we know as laughter, we're all very familiar with. And so each element of humour and therefore its overall experience is fundamentally dependent on and affected by the social context. Now, although the psychological elements of humour are interesting up to a point, and they are, I do think it is worth exploring some of the theories of humour and why it's so fundamental to human beings. I'm just going to go through these reasonably quickly. Now, the question of what makes something funny has perplexed scholars for centuries. And often there are put forward a number of theories to answer the question. And there are three kind of theories of humor that have been influential in explaining humor. And I'm just going to go through these. And they are relief, superiority, and incongruity theories. And I'll briefly go through each in turn. Relief theories focus primarily on intrapersonal needs, proposing that mirth and laughter result from the fulfillment of motivations or needs, namely the relief of tension, either in the form of physiological arousal or forbidden sexual and aggressive impulses. Like relief theories, superiority theories propose that the fulfillment of fundamental motives is central to all human experience. They, however, emphasize the interpersonal motive of self-enhancement. Mirth and laughter result from a sense of sudden triumph or feeling of superiority over another person or group of people. In contrast to relief and superiority theories, incongruity theories de-emphasize the role of motivation and focus instead on the cognitive processes involved in the perception and interpretation of a stimulus event, identifying perceptions of incongruity as minimally necessary for humor. The question of what makes something funny has perplexed scholars for centuries, and theorists have proposed numerous theories to answer this question. And three theories of humor have been influential in explaining humor. And these are relief, superiority, and incongruity theories. And I'll just go through each briefly. Now, relief theories focus primarily on intrapersonal needs, proposing that mirth and laughter result from the fulfillment of motivations or needs, namely the relief of tension, either in the form of physiological arousal or forbidden sexual and aggressive impulses. Like relief theories, superiority theories propose that the fulfillment of fundamental motives is central to all human experience. They, however, emphasize the interpersonal motive of self-enhancement. Mirth and laughter result from a sense of sudden triumph or feeling of superiority over another person or group of people. In contrast to relief and superiority theories, incongruity theories de-emphasize the role of motivation and focus instead on the cognitive processes involved in the perception and interpretation of a stimulus event. Now, each theory provides an explanation of something about the human experience, and it calls to attention important variables and processes involved in certain human experiences. However, they are not comprehensive, and in the sense they provide an explanation for the entirety of humor. Now, if anything, they lay the conceptual foundation to discuss the topic. For instance, Freud's theory of humor has had a significant influence on our understanding of humor, particularly during the first half of the 20th century. And so it's actually worth touching on briefly because it actually is very thought-provoking. Now, for those of you who are unaware, so Sigmund Freud's psychoanalytic view of humor was by far the most influential theory in psychological human research during the first half of the 20th century, and a period when Freud's general theory of psychology was quite prominent as a whole. Now, Freud proposed that each of us embodies a seething cauldron of conflicting motives and desires. Childish, immature, and largely unconscious sexual and aggressive libidinal drives residing in the id seek instant gratification. The superego, which incorporates the demands and dictates of society as embodied in the internalized parents, strongly opposes the impulses of the id. And then we have the ego, which attempts to find some adaptive compromise between the demands of the id, that's the ID or id, the superego, and the constraints of the external world, employing defense mechanisms to protect itself from the otherwise or overwhelming anxiety that arises from these conflicting forces. Early in his career, Freud turned his attention to the role of humour in the psychological drama. And Freud's work on humour is contained in two publications, and they'll be in the episode notes. But they are Jokes and Their Relation to the Unconscious, and then a short paper entitled Humour. And again, like I said before, they'll be provided in the episode descriptor. According to Freud, there are three different categories of laughter-related phenomena. The first one is jokes or wit. The second one is humour. And then the third one is the comic. And now each of these involves the release of psychic energy through laughter. So when it comes to jokes, we enjoy jokes so much because they allow us to experience for a moment the illicit pleasure of releasing primitive and sexual aggressive impulses. Now, Freud referred to the release of libidinal, sexual or aggressive impulses as the tendacious element of jokes, if you like, controversial jokes. This is why I guess why we are so attracted to them. Now, Freud stated that the pleasure in the case of a tendentious joke, arises from a purpose being satisfied whose satisfaction would otherwise not have taken place. And I think that's really important to note. In other words, Freud suggested that the pleasure derived from tendentious humour results from the savings of psychological energy spent on the usual inhibition of repressed impulses. Although Freud believed that most jokes involve the release of sexual or aggressive impulses, he suggested that there could be some non-aggressive and non-sexual jokes in which the enjoyment is derived only from clever cognitive processes. And so, if you like, joke work that enable one to momentarily regress to less logical and rational. It's like a childish modes of thinking. Now, in the second element, humour, Freud's second category of laughter-related phenomena, humour, was defined in sharp distinction from jokes or wit. And humour referred to a benign and sympathetic amusement with the ironic misfortunes of life. Humour represented the tension release function of mirth and laughter as a way of coping with stress. Now, according to Freud, humour, in this old-fashioned, narrow sense, is a defence mechanism that allows us to face difficult situations without becoming overwhelmed by unpleasant emotion. Indeed, according to Freud, and I think this is really interesting, humour is the highest of the defence mechanisms, since it enables the individual to avoid unpleasant emotions while still maintaining a realistic view of a situation. The pleasure of humour arises from the release of energy that would have been associated with a painful emotion. A person exhibits humour when they are able to laugh at their own weaknesses, social blunders, or difficult circumstance. For example, the individual who was able to see the funny side of things despite having suffered a serious financial loss would be demonstrating humour. So too are people laughing at funerals, and I have seen that many times myself. All right. Whereas jokes and humour are verbal, Freud's third category, the comic, refers to non-verbal sources of mirth, such as a circus clowns and the pompous person slipping on the banana peel, for instance. In such situations, the observer mobilises a certain amount of mental energy in anticipation of what is expected to happen. When the expected does not occur, this mental energy becomes superfluous and is released in laughter. Freud suggested that the comic involves delighted laughter at childish behaviour in oneself or others, which he described as the regained lost laughter of childhood. Comical situations might also contain some tendentious elements, allowing for the pleasurable release of libidinal energy. The pompous person slipping on a banana peel is a good example. And the fact that he is pompous makes the scene amusing because it permits the expression of some aggressive impulses. It could not be nearly as funny if the mishap occurred to a small child or to a person who engenders sympathy. Thus, like jokes, the comic often contains at least a tinge of aggression. All right, let's go to the second theory of superiority theories. Now, the earliest approach to humour was grounded in the view that humour is actually a form of aggression, and that amusement results from the feeling of superiority or triumph one feels over other people. Theories based on this view have been collectively called superiority theories. The superiority theory tradition dates back to the writings of classical Greek philosophers. Plato stated that laughter originates in malice. According to Plato, we laugh at what is ridiculous in other people, feeling delight instead of pain when we see even our friends suffer misfortune. Likewise, Aristotle saw comedy as an imitation of people who are worse than the average and viewed it as a species of the ugly. And this is why Aristotle suggested that the distinction between comedy and tragedy is that comedy represents people as worse than they actually are, whereas tragedy represents people as better than they actually are. Therefore, both Plato and Aristotle argued that people find humour in the foibles and weaknesses of others, and that laughter is an expression of derision or malice. Then we have the writings of the 17th century British philosopher Thomas Hobbes, who further reinforced the general acceptance of the superiority view for several centuries. And then Hobbes explicitly emphasised the importance of self-esteem enhancement that results from observing the misfortunes of others. It just makes us feel better, right? And he suggested that people are amused by the derision or the misfortunes of others because they feel good about themselves by comparison. Now, Hobbes' central proposition that defines the superiority theory approach to humour is that humour results from the self-enhancing feelings of superiority derived from the derision of another person or of one's own past blunders or foolishness. Theorists have expanded upon Hobbes' classic superiority theory by grounding this central tenet in evolutionary processes that humour is a form of playful aggression, where there is a perception of winners or losers. Now, supporting superiority theory, there is an abundant evidence that people experience mirth and laughter at the derision or misfortune of others. In fact, intuitively, you see that pretty much everywhere. Indeed, many of the jokes that are so popular in our culture today often involve the disparagement of others, such as members of either sex, various national ethnic groups, overweight people, people of low intelligence, and I could go on, and that could actually potentially be quite a long list if I wanted it to be. Now, when it comes to relief theories and superiority theories, both emphasize the fundamental importance of one's motivation and perceiving something as funny, paying little attention to the cognitive process involved in perceiving a stimulus or event as funny. And this is where incongruity theories step in. And they make an important contribution to humour because what they do is basically they take into consideration those aspects. So when they were introduced around the 1960s and 1970s, they actually drew attention to how people cognitively process a stimulus or event. And they identified the structural qualities of a stimulus or an event that are necessary for one to perceive it as funny. Now, when it comes to this theory, the cause of laughter involves the activation of two normally incompatible frames of reference that have been thought through. And laughter itself is just the expression of this incongruity, and that's why it's called the incongruity theory. Now, when perceived incongruity is sufficient to elicit humour, it must be resolvable or make sense in some way, and also part of the non-serious humour mindset. Now, let's just stop for a moment. Now, what makes you laugh? Is it jokes, the disparagement or misfortune of others, maybe the cartoons and so on? There's a lot to think about here when it comes to humour. So let's just stop here for a minute and think about the role of humour in health and well-being. And have you ever been wondering, or have ever considered maybe, whether watching a funny movie may affect your mood? Could it reduce anxiety and depression? Does having a good sense of humour help people cope with the stresses and adversities of life? I mean, maybe does it contribute to overall happiness and positive sense of health and well-being? Now, the idea that humour and laughter are good for one's health and well-being has actually been popular in recent years and among the general public and healthcare practitioners alike. And this is not actually a new idea, which I wasn't surprised by, but knew about, and I'll explain why in a minute. Now, indeed, since the time of Plato and Aristotle, as I kind of referred to earlier, they've actually suggested the important role of humour and laughter as health benefits. And some examples they gave back then was, it can help boost circulation, aid digestion, restore energy, counteract depression, enhancing the function of various organs of the body. Isn't that interesting? And this view has been enjoying a recent resurgence as modern medical discoveries like endorphins, cytokines, natural killer cells, and immunoglobulins have been added to the list of bodily substances that are thought to be beneficially affected by humour and laughter. And so this is where, obviously, modern-day science steps in. Now, research mainly from the field of psychology have provided considerable support for the hypothesis that humour regulates emotions that directly relate to psychological well-being. Now, that's actually an interesting point, something worth thinking about and noting yourself. Now, at least in the short term, humour produces an increase in positive feelings of mirth and well-being, along with the perceptions of mastery and control and a reduction in negative feelings such as anxiety, depression, and anger. That's interesting. And experimental studies have also demonstrated that humour mitigates the negative impact of stressful events by creating a positive lens or perspective for interpreting stressful events. Overall, studies have largely corroborated experimental research in support of the stress buffering hypothesis that humour helps people cope with stress. Well, I know from my own experiences that humour is fantastic. It helps me cope with stress and stressful events all the time. I guess that's why producer Luke and I like to have a laugh. Well, it's not just producer Luke and I, but with people in general. And I guess this is why psychologists have expressed an increased interest in the role of humour in psychotherapy. However, they do acknowledge that further research is needed to investigate its beneficial or in other words, detrimental to treating specific types of psychological problems with specific types. So what is clear from the research, though, is these kind of three things, and I'll just go through these quickly. Humour directly relates to more positive psychology of well-being. Humour helps people cope with stressful events, like I mentioned before, and humour facilitates healthy relationships. It helps with that kind of social bonding that occurs in those kind of social kind of relationships we have. Although the research offers some interesting insights into the positive benefits of humour and health, there is little evidence that people who have a better sense of humour and laugh more frequently enjoy better health overall or live longer. Now, nevertheless, even though more humorous and cheerful people may not live longer, they may enjoy a better quality of life and greater overall life satisfaction. At the end of the day, this is what I think. It's worth pointing out that even though humour may not produce these claimed health benefits, it's not actually going to be harmful to you. And it can actually enhance people's enjoyment, if not the duration of their lives. So there certainly is some merit to this line of argument. And there's certainly nothing wrong with encouraging people to enjoy humour and to actually have a laugh more often, which might indirectly affect aspects of health positively. Some of you may have heard about or seen on TV an intervention approach known as humour or laughter therapy, which is an approach that uses humour and laughter to promote physical, emotional, and social well-being. It's based on the idea that laughter triggers beneficial physiological and psychological changes in the body. So how does this humour and laughter therapy work? Well, basically, from a psychological point of view, laughter activates the release of endorphins. That's that body's natural feel-good chemicals, which can reduce pain and create feelings of pleasure. It also decreases stress hormones like cortisol and adrenaline while boosting immune system function by increasing antibodies and activating immune cells. Now, I've done an episode on stress. Make sure you check that out. It's actually quite useful in understanding how this actually works. Now, during laughter, your heart rate and blood pressure initially increase, then drop below baseline levels, creating a relaxation response similar to moderate exercise. Now, that's interesting. Just my previous episode on physical activity, if you want to know more about what moderate exercise means. So laughter actually helps shift your perspective and making problems seem less overwhelming and more manageable. It can interrupt negative thought processes and provide more an emotional distance from stressful situations. And the social aspect of shared laughter also strengthens relationships and reduces the feeling of isolation. That's a little bit what I was talking before about. Now, some common applications. Humour and laughter therapy is used in various healthcare settings, including hospitals, nursing homes, mental health facilities, and so on. It's employed to help patients cope with chronic pain, depression, anxiety, and just the general stress of kind of medical treatment. Now, some cancer centres and rehabilitation facilities incorporate humour programs into their treatment protocols. And the most common ones are these. So laughter clubs where groups engage in structured laugh exercises, clown therapy programs in hospitals, humour-based psychotherapy sessions, comedy viewing as part of treatment plans. Now, one well-known example of using humour and laughter is actually in a health setting is actually Patch Adams, whose real name is actually Dr. Hunter Patch Adams. And he's a well-known American medical doctor who uses quite unorthodox methods such as humour, a clown persona, and has a focus on joy so he can connect and treat his patients. And he's controversial for a whole range of reasons, but he's known for being the founder of what's called the Gesundheit Institute. And this unorthodox approach is actually depicted quite well in the Hollywood movie titled actually Patch Adams. And the character Patch Adams is played by Robin Williams, who is excellent in this role. So if you want to understand why his approach was kind of controversial in the medical fraternity, it's actually worthwhile checking out that movie. Basically, Patch Adams' approach revolves around kind of three areas, and they are humour as medicine, it's kind of holistic patient care, and that kind of compassionate kind of connection. Now, just a word of caution. While laughter therapy isn't a cure-all, research suggests it can be a valuable complementary approach alongside conventional medical treatments, particularly for managing stress, improving mood, enhancing quality of life during illness or recovery. So I just want to kind of point that out. Now, before I finish this episode, I just want to explore some applications, and I'm just going to look at 2 to 3 applications. And so the first one, I'm just going to look at humour in the educational workplace or the workspace. And as you can imagine, from some of the earlier theories that I mentioned before, there is a potential for humour to go wrong in the classroom, if you like. But at the moment, many educators, and there's actually quite a few books and literature on this, have written popular books and scholarly articles about promoting humour as an effective teaching tool. However, the problem is that these are just all anecdotal, and there is limited to any research around its actual benefits or not. But mainly, they are just endorsements of humour. And like I said before, based on anecdotal evidence and teachers' reports of their own experiences in the classroom. However, there's limited to empirical research on this. Basically, the research looks at kind of 5 broad areas. I'll just go through them very quickly. I'm not going to drill down on them, but basically they're saying that how often and in what ways do teachers use humour in the classroom? Does humour affect students' perceptions of the classroom environment? Third one, does humour improve students' ability to learn and retain information? Fourth one, does humour reduce anxiety and improve test performance? And 5, does humour in textbooks help students learn the material? Now, as you can see here, there is a potential for this to be quite controversial because humour can go wrong very quickly. And as someone who's been a classroom teacher for a long time, I know how this could go wrong very, very quickly. So you can understand there would be a fair bit of reservation by teachers to use humour in classrooms, particularly when they're dealing with sensitive topics. Look, at the end of the day, there is more research that needs to be done, but really what they're talking about is if you're going to implement it as a teaching approach, look, at the end of the day, it comes down to employing the right type of humour under the right conditions at the right time, and making sure that you have the right type of classroom that are motivated and receptive to what you might be getting at. So I think that's where you need to be very selective. If you're an educator or a teacher listening to this, you would need to be very, very selective and be cognizant of what you're trying to do with it. Now, to any teachers who may be listening, do you use humour in your classroom? If so, how? And if not, why? And I think it's important for us to pause for a moment and just think about how we use humour, if at all, and if not, why. From my own perspective, I would be quite hesitant to use humour in my classroom because I know that it can go wrong very quickly, and it's very easy for students to misinterpret what you might be getting at with your humour. And of course, I'm coming from the perspective of a university academic. However, I am aware, I should say, that there are others out there who do use humour all the time. And so I guess that's where I think it is worth reflecting and thinking about how it can be applied and in what way. The other place I want to talk to you about other applications around kind of workplace. Interesting enough, it's actually made its way into the workplace. We have these kind of humour consultants. In fact, I've actually seen or been part of professional development work programs where we've had someone who's come in to talk to us about how we can actually use humour. Basically, humour consultants view humour from a functionalist or utilitarian perspective. That is, they see humour as a planned activity which they exploit for the benefit of the organisation. So they're guns for hire. They're trying to boost productivity. Now, typically, humour consultants advocate humour that does not question or challenge the corporate status quo, and they basically promote the use of humour at work that appeals to both management and the employees by giving both a greater sense of control. You can see how this could be potentially controversial. Now, interesting enough, research in this area is looking at humour and leadership in the workplace, which is interesting. And it's recognising a link between humour and organisational culture and between humour and leadership. Now, an organisation's humour climate is shared perceptions of how employees in a particular work group use and express humour. And they can, as you can imagine, be beneficial or detrimental as an individual's employees and to the quality of the interactions among employees. Now, obviously, positive humour climate, employees and managers engage in affiliation or affiliative and self-enhancing humour in the form of amusing anecdotes and joking comments that actually serve to reinforce friendly and collegial relationships. It can be positive. And so such positive uses of humour appear to be beneficial outcomes, such as less boredom, greater satisfaction with co-workers, greater team cooperation, and so on and so forth. And on the flip side of that, the negative humour climate, employees and managers use humour aggressively to disparage, tease, or ridicule others, to enforce social norms or undermine existing power relationships. And so negative use of humour seem to have quite a detrimental impact on employees and their relationship with others. One particular type of negative humor is the use of derogatory humor as a form of kind of harassment. So you can see where things could go wrong pretty quickly. In view of the complexity of humor and some of the things that we've kind of looked at already in this episode, it does seem rather simplistic and naive to suggest, as do some humor consultants, that simply increasing the level of humor and fun in an organization will just necessarily result in many desirable changes and improve productivity. I think if you ask me, it's actually a bit nonsense anyway, but it is part and parcel of organizations today. As in other areas, humour in the context of work seems to be best viewed as a type of social skill or interpersonal competence, which can be used for negative as well as positive purposes. So if you ask me, the task of managers and business consultants shouldn't be about increasing the levels of humour among employees, but I think they should attempt to understand the ways in which humour that already exists reflects the power dynamics and general culture within the organisation. If they want to improve the quality of humour in the workplace, it actually might require efforts to change the overall organisational culture and maybe power structures rather than simply have workers attend a workshop where they can learn to tell funny stories and just engage in silly activities for the sake of it. And that's why I just say, listen, if there are any managers or leaders who may be listening to this, do you use humour in your workplace? If so, how? If not, why? I dare say it's probably no, because of all those complexities and possibilities for it to go wrong. Dare I say it, go wrong very quickly. Now, before I finish, Lucas asked me to make a few points about humour and whether humour can be used by parents. If you're a parent, and I'm a parent, have you ever tried to use humour as part of your parenting? If not, then the following actually might be of interest to you. Now, when it comes to the use of humour in families, and actually in parenting, the research indicates that humour in families can actually help improve relationships in a positive way. There's no surprise there. And take, for instance, the article Humour in Parenting. Does it have a role? And the details of the article will be in the episode descriptor, like always. And I've just kind of summarised the article into kind of three broad areas. So we have stress relief. So obviously, if it's a very difficult situation, well, humour can actually help alleviate that and just lighten the general kind of tone of a conversation. That's, of course, if you do choose to use humour, it has that potential. It can help with bonding, and it can be used as a teaching tool. Now for some practical tips for any parents who may be interested in using humour in their family. All right, so some of these are kind of self-evident truisms, but the first one is create a warm and supportive environment. Look, at the end of the day, if a child doesn't feel supported, or if they feel like they're going to be ridiculed for being silly or for using humour, well, then they're not going to really do that. And likewise, it's the same with parents. If you feel like you're going to be ridiculed by others for using it, then it's unlikely you're going to do that. So, yes, it's tricky, it's difficult, but creating a warm and supportive atmosphere is central. Second one is the use of humour for connection, and if appropriate to do so, maybe consider how you could use it to correct inappropriate behaviour. Not easy. I'm the first person to acknowledge that, but maybe consider how you can just use something like that to kind of bring to attention some inappropriate behaviour. The third one is daily laughter integration strategies. So it could be just bedtime routines. So you might read joke books or try a new book series that are funny. Maybe you can exchange jokes at dinner time. Maybe if you're stuck in traffic, you might say a joke just to lighten the mood. Using silly voices and playing. I think of Bluey straight away, where there are many episodes like that. And of course, there are physical comedy. You might loosen up, maybe do some dancing or put on costumes and just have a general time to be silly and funny together. Fourth one is just kind of modelling resilience through humour. Look, at the end of the day, we make mistakes as parents, but it's about modelling that. So it's about laughing at your mistakes. I think about all the silly mistakes I make, but I try and have a laugh about it with my kids. For instance, I'm forever spilling food, or when I head off to work, I go to clean my teeth and I have toothpaste down my front. I come out to the kids and I say, oh, look, do you reckon I should wear this to work? And of course the answer is no, but we all have a bit of a laugh at my expense. And the fifth one is make humour intentional but natural. Look, it's a bit like what I said before. Where possible, it does help to kind of just do something a little bit silly every now and then to lighten the mood, depending on what it is. Now, a word of caution I should point out here, and I think it's important I say this before I wrap this up. Now, humour at the end of the day needs to be at the right level, and it needs to take into consideration a range of factors. For instance, It's never suitable to poke fun, tease, or be sarcastic or have any kind of hostile or nasty edge to it when it comes to using humour. In fact, we already know for very young kids, and in particular, they might be confused or hurt by it. And actually, so too are colleagues. So it's not really just young kids. But I mention young kids because the research is pretty clear here that taking a joke, and I know I mentioned, can we take a joke anymore? Well, children under the age of 8 to 10 years of age, look, they literally cannot understand sarcasm because they interpret words literally and they miss nonverbal cues. And so most children don't develop the ability to hold two conflicting ideas in the mind until after the age of 7. So I can understand why, you would be very hesitant if you're a classroom teacher or even a parent if you have kids under that age. So that is worth taking into consideration. I know I mentioned that earlier about can we take a joke anymore? Well, I would say if you're dealing with young children, the answer is probably not, and there are reasons why. At the end of the day, there are a couple of red flags. So I just say to you some of the universal red flags across any setting and environment for red flags. So a person or persons might likely cross the line when they target insecurities, differences, or struggles. It requires defending with you can't take a joke. So anytime you hear that, kind of is a bit of a red flag. What, you can't take a joke anymore? After insulting someone, for instance, continues after someone shows distress. So if you see someone is upset by a joke and you continue to pile on, I think that's a problem. You use sarcasm with those who can't understand it. So again, like I said before, with young children under the age of 8, 9, maybe neurodivergent individuals or other kind of populations that would have difficulty understanding jokes. Now, and of course, any humour that creates exclusion or reinforces hierarchies is a problem, and it masks genuine criticism or hostility. So if you're a boss and you're using humour in that way, that's kind of problematic. Look, at the end of the day, the research consistently shows that verbal bullying and teasing negatively affects mental health more than we realise, with particular strong impacts on young or more vulnerable individuals. Even though therapeutic laughter has the capacity to have a positive impact on health and well-being, misguided humour that targets, excludes, or demeans can actually have a long-lasting psychological harm across all relations and settings. So I guess this is why people are very, hesitant to use humour, which makes me sad a little bit. The key is ensuring humour builds connection. I guess that's why it's difficult, rather than asserts power or masks aggression, particularly when we know humour has that capacity to be a form of playful aggression. And I guess this is why humour is tricky to use, particularly when it comes to young children, like I said before, even work colleagues and in the workplace, or dare I say it, educational settings. Anyway, that is plenty to think about. So I think I might just leave it there. So I want to leave you with a few takeaway points. Humour and laughter are universal and fundamental human experiences occurring in all cultures and virtually all individuals throughout the world, and in nearly every type of interpersonal relationship. The perception that something is funny seems to be fundamental in defining humour. However, we use the term humour in a variety of contexts to mean different things. As a result, the term humour has come to represent all phenomena relating to the humour experience. So it's important to point out that humour is a social phenomenon in which other people provide the context in which we experience humour. And from a psychological perspective, humour represents a form of social play. And so no definition of humour, no theory of wit, no explanation of comic laughter will ever stand up, which is not based upon the distinction between playful and the serious. Basically, humour is a form of social play that can be divided into 3 essential psychological elements, and they are related to cognition, emotion, and behaviour. And the question of what makes something funny has perplexed scholars for centuries. And I guess you could say theorists have proposed a number of ways of explaining this question about what humour is. But there are 3 theories of humour have been influential in this explanation of what it is. And these are relief, superiority, and incongruity theories. The idea that humour and laughter are good for one's health has become quite popular in recent years and among the general public and healthcare practitioners alike. And this idea is not new. But research, and I find this interesting, mainly from the field of psychology, have provided considerable support for the hypothesis that humour regulates emotions that directly relate to psychological well-being, at least in the short term anyway. And humour produces an increase in positive feelings of mirth and well-being, along with perceptions of mastery and control, and a reduction in negative feelings such as anxiety, depression, and anger. Experimental studies have also demonstrated that humour mitigates the negative impact of stressful events by creating a positive lens or perspective for interpreting stressful events. Overall, studies have largely corroborated experimental research in support of its stress buffering hypothesis that humour helps people cope with stress. Look, at the end of the day, it helps us cope. What is clear from the research literature on humour is there are three things, and they are: humour directly relates to more positive psychology well-being, it helps us cope with stressful events, and it helps with facilitating healthy relationships. They're the three biggies that I want you to think of. Although the research offers some interesting insights into the positive benefits of humour on health, there is little evidence that people who have a better sense of humour and laugh more frequently enjoy better health overall or live longer. Look, at the end of the day, it's kind of irrelevant, because I say why, because it's worth pointing out that even though humour might not produce these kind of health benefits, it's actually not going to harm you. So I say to you, there is some merit in the argument that there's nothing wrong with encouraging people to enjoy humour and actually laugh more, and say through humour or laughter therapy. In fact, it actually just might improve the quality of your life in general. Now, the acceptance and application of humour in educational workplace settings is a relatively recent phenomena. However, the enthusiastic endorsements of humour in education are based on anecdotal evidence. And look, there just needs to be more research on how humour can be used in educational settings. As for humour in the workplace, this research is controversial because it seems rather simplistic and naive to suggest that simply just increasing the level of humour and fun in an organisation will result in many desirable changes and improved productivity. Now, I finished by considering the role of humour in parenting, and I did suggest some practical tips for parents who may be interested in using humour. I warn that humour needs to be introduced at the right level and take into consideration a range of factors. For example, children under the age of 8 to 10 years of age literally cannot understand sarcasm or even some jokes because they interpret words literally and miss non-verbal cues. Now, most children don't develop that ability to hold two conflicting ideas in their mind until around the age of 7. So I outlined some pretty universal flags across all settings that are a useful guide for demonstrating when a person or person crosses the line. And I finished by just saying, look, even though therapeutic laughter has the capacity to have a positive impact on health and well-being, misguided humour that targets, excludes, or demeans can cause psychological harm across all relationships and settings. The key is ensuring humour builds connection rather than asserts power or masks aggression. So there we have it. Laughter is one of the most profound forms of relief, a gift that emerges precisely when we need it most. It doesn't solve our problems, but it reminds us that we're more resilient than we think, more connected than we feel, and more capable of joy than our circumstances might suggest. Perhaps the most beautiful thing about laughter is that it's democratic. It doesn't require wealth, education, or perfect circumstances. It just simply requires our willingness to recognise the absurd, to find lightness in heaviness, and to trust that sometimes the best response to life's complexity is to throw back our heads and laugh. This week, I encourage you to notice when laughter appears in your life. Don't dismiss it as frivolous. Honour it as a sophisticated coping mechanism it truly is. And maybe, just maybe, allow yourself to laugh a little more freely, knowing that in doing so, you're participating in one of humanity's oldest and wisest traditions. Until next time, keep thinking deeply, keep finding reasons to smile, and remember, sometimes the most profound relief comes wrapped in the simplest joy. This has been Deep Thinking with Dr. Stephen Stoltz. Thanks for listening, and don't forget to subscribe and tell others about my podcast. Until next time, stay curious and think deeply. I want to extend my sincere thanks to producer Luke Watson, aka Producer Luke, the truckie from Petrie, for his exceptional and ongoing work on this episode. Luke's careful attention to the nuances of sound, his creative insights, and his feedback, and making sure that each episode is as good as it possibly can be is really important. Thanks, mate. Also, a big shout out to Shofi, who was one of my super fans. Thanks for listening and for your words of encouragement, Shofi.